Listen, I know I highlight supports in terms of a lot of my videos and critiques of Overwatch. And there's good reason for that. But a lot of people seem to come at me in comments and stuff being like, well, what about Roadhog? What about Orisa? What about these specific tanks or that one DPS? Listen, just because I don't mention a specific hero or, I leave someone out, it doesn't mean that I think that that kit is perfect. It just means that I'm highlighting or focusing on one thing at a time. And also, I don't focus on tanks too much because of the fact that why would you want to like beat up somebody that's already down? Right? Like that doesn't to me that doesn't help. Like yes, there are tanks that are problematic, but that's not my biggest concern because of the fact that the reason why you have problematic tanks are because of the fact that it's a way to deal with the other problematic abilities and whatnot in the game. But just to make it fair, okay, let's talk about Roadhog. Roadhog and Orisa, right? We're going to go into the trading ground here. Now, the way that Overwatch works in general is you have characters that have a set of abilities, and usually one ability on that character, I'm going to use Tracer because I always like to use Tracer. Uh, one character or one ability on that character is like what I would consider their key crucial ability, right? That ability is the one that you need to play around for Tracer to recall. If she has her recall up, that means she can play more aggressive. If it's down, that means she's vulnerable, right? So if I go in and I try to get a kill and I don't and I recall, now I have to start shooting from this angle. I have to start playing a little bit safer and I have to play a bit more passively, right? There's an obvious weakness towards her kit. Every character in Overwatch has an obvious weakness. That's what helps make Overwatch good. Is you're like, okay, there's ways to play around it. And there's strengths and weaknesses to everything. And that's where sort of balancing and tuning comes in. Tracer's range is not as good as Cassidy or Widowmaker. And this is why, for instance, Cassidy is a good counter to Tracer because Tracer's got low health. And what hurts Tracer is two things burst damage and immobilizing her. Cassidy can do both of those things. But the problem is when you start to buff their weaknesses in terms of getting rid of them entirely, right? Cassidy already had the upper hand against Tracer with his burst damage and his immobility, immobilizer, right? Now, the one thing that Tracer had on him was being able to pulse him. It was a high risk. It was a high risk play because your pulse isn't guaranteed to hit. It's not always consistent. Sometimes you just yeet it out there and hope for the best. But then they're like, we're gonna buff his role to where he has damage reduction on it, and you can no longer pulse him. And it's like, but like that's every like 6 seconds too. So now, even in a situation where Tracer could outplay a Cassidy in a way, you took away one of his key weaknesses, right? A lot of Overwatch, what they've done is they've been buffing the parts where it's just like, hey, we're giving more control to the players. But in doing so, you've taken away control from other people, which means people die less, a lot less. And that's the part where it's less fun because then you have so many different abilities and resources to track that you can't keep track of it all. And even then, you feel like you still need to make a play, which is the reason why when people are like, oh, why don't you just resource track? It's just like because now everything is just buffed to the point there's no inherent weaknesses anymore. You used to be able to boop Reaper off of an edge, but now he can TP back on. And it's also faster than it used to be. So now let's talk about Roadhog because this is about tanks, right? Roadhog had inherent weaknesses in Overwatch 1. He was high risk, high reward, right? Like he could do a lot of damage, he could get one shots, but he didn't have a shield. He didn't have a whole lot of defensive parts about him. He displaced people. That was kind of like his kit. He could one shot people, but also he was a big ult battery for the enemy team. You could charge your ult off of him really easily. You could kill him really easily. You could stun him out of his heal, in which you could then punish him for it. You could stun him out of his ult, and you could punish him for it. But now Roadhog, in order to try and make him viable, they're like, okay, well, he no longer gives as much alt charge. Okay, so took away one of his weaknesses. You no longer do as much damage to him because we've reduced the damage on all tanks. It's like, okay, so even that doesn't really work. Interrupting his heal doesn't really matter. He can just heal it again right afterwards. And his ultimate, you can't interrupt either. So we've removed every weakness that he has, but he can still one-shot. This is the problem of Roadhog, but this is also the problem of like tanks in general and like even just Overwatch in general, Overwatch 2 in general. Characters need to have an inherent weakness, an open window of opportunity in which you can attack and kill someone because they made a mistake and they misuse their abilities. There is no way to really counter a sort of Roadhog or whatnot, but through just their abilities alone. It's literally just, you just need to shoot him a lot, right? And it's not fun when you're playing a DPS, or you're playing a support, or you're playing a tank or something, and you're just sitting there, and I know they have lower health in this mode too, in the training mode, doing this while he's healing and while his teammates are healing him, and there's an immortality that comes out and saves him, and he just stays alive forever. And doing this, even if you were to dodge a hook, even if you were to, stun him out of his heal, it doesn't matter. This sort of gameplay is no different than me just doing this. I'm just shooting a wall. And this is the reason why buffing tanks' health wasn't the play, because you didn't give tanks the ability to outplay their opponent in a unique and interesting way. You just buff them to be a really big fucking wall that can one-shot you. And this is why Orisa and Hog are not fun to go against, because you're just shooting a wall. And no matter how much you shoot that wall, a good person playing that character is just never going to die because they know to play their cover, they know when to rotate. So as you're just sitting there doing this constantly, and it feels like you're not getting anywhere. And even in those situations where you're like, oh, okay, like I'm fighting against Roadhog, and I dodged the hook, and I didn't get hit by the trap, and I dodged a second hook, and then he kills you anyway, you're like, well, as the player on the other end, what was I supposed to do in that situation? And the answer is always from people like, oh, well, why don't you play as a team? It's a team game. It's just like, sure. But if the only answer you have is that you have to have your teammates' coordination, there's no way for you to individually outplay the other person on the other end, you're going to cause a whole lot of frustration that was never there to begin with. I'm a Tracer mate. I could outplay a Roadhog in Overwatch 1 and kill him, even though he technically had the advantage, in the same way that I could technically outplay a Cassidy, or they could outplay me. See? Like, you need that back and forth of being able to say, like, well, there was something I could have done in that situation. There was something I could have played or done better. Tracer is all about blinking, trying to predict the hook. Hog is baiting blinks in order to land a hook. And Cassidy, it's the same sort of back and forth of you're trying to bait the flashbang and you're trying to hold the flashbang until you feel you've gotten her to a point where she doesn't have blinks, or, you're predicting her movement, right? There's that back and forth where you're like, okay, I could have done something better. Overwatch 2, there's nothing you can do better against a super mega buff tank. Because we didn't address the problems of the character. The solution to Roadhog is still the same. It's only worse now. How do you counter Roadhog that's a super buffed, mega buff tank? Well, you can't outplay him. So what do? You counter swap. Because that is so much more effective than trying to outplay someone who is hard countering you. And Roadhog didn't lose his strengths. It's not like we buffed his weaknesses and took away some of his strengths. We left his strengths and buffed his weaknesses. This is the overall problem with a lot of things, but like Roadhog and Orisa being highlights of them. Like, let's take a look at Orisa, right? Orisa. She has her Javelin, which I think is a good ability. The no fall-off damage is a weird and interesting choice. I don't think that's necessary, but the spear I think is a good ability. But then you have this ability, which means that you can't shoot her. And then you have this ability, which means that you can't shoot her. You can't even headshot her. So not only does Fortify make it so you can't be stunned, even so it's a sort of ability where you can sort of like time it to where like, okay, I timed it for a Rhine Shatter, I timed it for a stun. Like all two of her abilities are literally negate damage. And then on top of that, she's one of the tanks that has a shit ton of armor. So what is Orisa? But nothing more than a walking wall. But if she lands a spear, she can also kill a squishy really easily. Her and Roadhog have that same problem of like, it's not bad to have abilities that negate damage. It's just, what is their weakness, and don't say counter swapping. Like, even in the situations where, you counter them, like, counters were always in Overwatch 1 a little bit better, in my opinion, because of the fact that even when you countered someone, it didn't mean that you hard won. It mean that you had an advantage. Like Cassidy versus Tracer was always one that I appreciated because of the fact that when you went up against a good Cassidy, he had the advantage, but you could outplay him. And both sides, whether they died or won, knew that they could have played the situation better. That's what good counters in Overwatch used to be. But now, if I'm playing Zarya, and even though I have 2 bubbles, because of the fact that there is a Reinhardt, because of the fact that they buffed Reinhardt's health and they buffed his shield when they and they buffed the health and they buffed the tanks all at once. What used to happen was you'd play a bit slower, and you would get your charge up, and then Ryan would maybe charge in, or he'd make a mistake, and you're like, oh, I can capitalize on this moment. But now even when you're charged up, because of how much health they have, how much damage reduction they have, and how much more healing they get versus everybody else, and how much less ult charge you get, now a Reinhardt can charge in, make mistakes, and not be punished for it in a way that is anything meaningful. So what you do instead is you're like, well, I'm at such a disadvantage playing Zarya that it no longer benefits me to play this hero. Even if I'm halfway to my ult, it makes more sense to switch to a different hero that can deal with him. And then he gets put in a situation where there's no point in holding on to his ult because now he's hard countered in a way that it just makes sense to switch. This is the reason why people complain about 5v5 so much, and the reason why buffing tanks made the game worse. It didn't address the problems, it made the problems worse. Like, I don't know why it was done this way. Like, I think for giving Winston a right click for Overwatch 2 was pretty smart. I think that was like addressing one of his weaknesses. I don't understand what the point was behind buffing the health, because what people really wanted was the ability to outplay your opponent. You don't outplay your opponent that way. Like, you just do everything they do but better. Same with like Zarya's bubbles. Zarya's bubbles having an inherent weakness of them only lasting 2 seconds, which is still a considerably long time, to 2.5 seconds. 2.5 seconds in Overwatch is a really long time to not be able to shoot someone. Like, sure, you can break the bubbles in very specific instances where you want to, but 2.5 seconds when you know she's got low charge and you don't want to give her more is a long time to guarantee value and space, especially if she uses a bubble on someone, which she could do, twice. So that's what I mean when I'm like, there are tanks in this game that are for sure a problem, but I'm not about to punch the kid that's already on the ground, right? Why did I say kid? Whatever. I'm not about to like, pick on these heroes which already are hard countered by supports who get to be in the safest position. Because even if we wanted to pick on the tanks, which there are issues with, the tank is a lot of times sitting, up here fighting, right? And they're getting shot at. They have to control that space, but they are not able to see what everyone else is doing. They don't get the DPS passive applied, and they're not able to see who the DPS passive is applied to. So for them, they just have to always play assuming that their team sort of has their back. They'll turn around once, look to see their team, and then from then on, they mostly, for the most part, have to be facing forward. But when you look at a support is going to be back here, who can see the entire fight, who can see everything that's happening, has the awareness of what's going on, can heal safely, can use immortalities that don't miss, and use ultimates that are massive AoE things that guarantee free value. A Junker Queen, if you're playing Junker Queen and you're playing up against a team, you have to watch out for Suzu, you have to check for life grip, you have to check for May walls, you have to resource track so much more in order to get value. Whereas if you just press Kitsune or you just press Orbital Ray, you just get value. Junker Queen has to land her knife, she has to play close. There's an inherent risk and reward to playing all these heroes, and Overwatch is a fine balance of making sure that you give people strengths, but you also make sure that they have an inherent weakness. Giving players more control all the time isn't necessarily a good thing when you remove those weaknesses, because then there are certain heroes that still maintain and hold on to those weaknesses that still exist in the game. Like Genji. I'm always going to pick on Genji because Genji used to be this character that was this high skill, high reward type character. And I enjoyed playing up against them because of the fact that even when there was a Nano Blade, if you shattered them or you grabbed him, it would counter one ult for two. And as powerful as Nano Blade was, there was an inherent weakness in it. You in Overwatch 2, because of the fact that it's so easy to deny, playing this high risk hero that has to get in and be up close and doesn't have great like accuracy from long range, it's just so easy to counter him, especially with all of the auto aim heals, all of the deny immortalities, all of the abilities that auto aim. Like, it makes it so people who want to play this hero just don't feel like they get to, because why would they play that hero when other heroes exist that can deny them easier, or there's other heroes that can get more value for doing a lot less work, right? Because yeah, like when you, this is where the balance comes in, where you need to make sure characters have inherent weaknesses. You have to in a hero based shooter, and you can soften up some of those weaknesses to where it's not as bad. But at the end of the day, like, everyone needs to have a weakness, but also they need to have the ability to outplay their situations. Going back to Junker Queen and Roadhog, Junker Queen doesn't have a shield or a defensive ability to counter a Ana sleep dart and nade, right? But Junker Queen is a lot skinnier and a lot harder to hit than a Roadhog is. So it sort of makes sense that it's just like, okay, well, she's a tank and she's more of a brawly tank, but she's also a lot harder to hit. That sort of makes it a bit fair, where it's just like, yeah, she's weak to sleep and nade, but it's also harder to hit her, so it's not so bad. Roadhog, the counter to him is always just Ana. Like, he's super easy to hit. He's super easy to nade. These are all things where he doesn't have an ability in which to counter the sleep and nade problem. So he requires a Kiriko. Like, pretty much has to have a Kiriko. That's where you sort of get this one-dimensional Overwatch 2 gameplay where it's just like, hey, the tank is super buffed to the point that even when you make mistakes, you're still not punished for it, which ruins the game for everybody else, and it makes it not fun on the other end. But then as Roadhog, because you're super buffed to that point, you have to have an Ana to counter him, and if you don't, there's not much you can do because you're just shooting a wall. But then once you have to have an Ana, then you have to have a Kiriko on the Hog team in order to counter that. This is where you don't have the choice anymore. You're not given the opportunity to choose how you want to play. You're not sitting there thinking, well, I don't want to play Kiriko. I want to play Ana, I want to play Zen, or I want to play Lucio or something. But you're not given that option anymore. Like, you now are forced into the situation where you have to counter swap, because that is the only way to play. And when they counter swap, you are forced to deal with their counter swapping. Like, this is why Overwatch 2 is more about counter swapping than it is about outplaying your opponent, because you didn't give people ways to outplay. For whatever reason, they took away Roadhog's one shot, and instead of giving him ways to outplay the Ana nade in some sort of interesting and meaningful way, they just made his one shot a little bit more complicated. And I don't think that was the issue. So yeah, if you're going to address anything in this game, like, yes, there are tanks that are problematic. Yes, there are issues that need to be addressed, and there's a lot of them. I'm gonna be honest. Like, I love Overwatch. I love the game, and I think there's a lot of potential there. But since season 9, things have progressively gotten worse, and the only takeaway we can get from season 9 is that healing was out of control. People were having more fun when stuff was dying and when it was Lucio and Moira in the meta than it was when immortalities and healing was out of control again. Making it so stuff can die in an FPS is really, really important. So yeah, post season 9, making projectiles bigger took away a lot of the risk. It took away a lot of the inherent strengths and weaknesses that characters had in the game. Buffing tanks and not addressing their pain points was a huge problem, and it made the game just worse. Because going up against a Roadhog or a Risa is not fun, and this is exactly why. No one wants to sit there and shoot a wall for 20 minutes and have it not go down. And also giving them the ability to one shot is not fun either. Like, in the same way that Cassidy versus Tracer matters, you need to make sure it's just like, okay, how I use my abilities matters, right? If I throw a flash and I miss, Tracer has the advantage. If Tracer misuses her blinks and I hit the flash, I have the advantage. Strengths and weaknesses. All characters need to have them. A lot of supports, like, the reason why I pick on supports is they don't have inherent weaknesses. If you dive a Kiriko, she's good up close, but she's also good from far away because she has no fall off. Suzu is another one-dimensional ability that you're not trying to. There's no way to misplay the Suzu. You're just trying to shoot her enough that she misses kunai, throws it, does this. But even if you get her low and you get Suzu, she gets away, right? And even if she gets away, she can climb walls. And she's got one of the best ults in the game. And she can't miss on any of her heals. Characters need to have an inherent risk associated with them that is obvious to players. So that way, when the player going up against that hero plays against them, they sit there and think to themselves, what could I have done differently in this situation? What is the obvious answer? For Cassidy, it's I could have blinked, I could have positioned farther away, I could have tried to bait the flashbang better. For Kiriko, it's literally just I don't take the fight. When I fight Kiriko, a lot of times my strategy stopped being try to take the duel with the Kiriko, and it was try to fight someone. And when I would see her TP in to make it a 2v1, I would leave the situation because I know that it's not worth trying to outplay this character that doesn't really have the same sort of risk involved. I mostly just want to get her to move around. But it requires so much more effort that you're constantly, the solution of Overwatch 2 is, hey, your entire team needs to have really, really amazing coordination for it to work. But also, we frequently chat ban people for mass reports, so nobody's in voice anymore. Overwatch 2 is creating its own problems. And that's the reason why I'm making these videos, is to point out, here's the problem, right? The problems you have with Kiriko are the same problems you have with Roadhog, or the same problems you have with Orisa, but the difference is that playing a tank in Overwatch 2 is literally you've been buffed to be booped, punched, shot, and just repeatedly beaten over and over again. But we took away a lot of tanks' kill potential. We took away the ability for their ults to have a lot of meaning. And the only thing that they're good at is getting shot. And that is not fun for players, especially for the tank players. Like, I used to play a lot more tank in Overwatch 1 because there was ways to outplay my opponents. There were ways to counter them because of the fact that their health pools weren't so large that if they made a mistake, they could be punished for it. That doesn't exist anymore. A lot of what existed in Overwatch 1 doesn't exist in Overwatch 2 anymore. So that's the reason why I'm making these videos. That's the reason why I'm trying to help. Like, I'm not doing this to be mean to the devs. I'm not doing this to just shit on supports. I'm doing this because of the fact that I love Overwatch, for one. It was one of my favorite games, top 5 for sure, if not 3. I've been a game developer for over 15 years. I've done this stuff. I know how this stuff works. Uh, and I've been like Masters GM in Overwatch from practically the beginning. Like I know this game well, I know game design well, and uh I know how to design around these things. And a lot of times what people or what Overwatch tends to do is they create unique and interesting characters that do stuff, but it's only fun from one perspective. My last video, I upset a few Lifeweaver mains. And listen, I'm not saying Lifeweaver isn't fun for you. It's just not fun for everyone else. And that's my point. In the same way that Lifeweaver isn't fun for everyone else, and Roadhog isn't fun for everyone else, and Orisa isn't fun for everyone else, I'm not saying that the people who play these heroes aren't having fun. I'm saying that they need to have an inherent weakness that makes it obvious for everyone as to how they could outplay that situation. Because right now it just doesn't exist. And I hope this clears up things when I say, by not talking about tanks, we're not talking about Roadhog or Risa or, like Sombra, which that's a whole other can of worms. I'm not leaving these heroes out because I think they're good in their current state. I'm leaving them out because I don't think that they're my biggest priority right now. They are not my biggest frustration. A lot of the tanks could be addressed by just toning their health back down, back to where it was. And Sombra needs someone who understands her kit and to design her. But uh, in terms of biggest problems in the game, I'm not too concerned about much of the DPS or tank roster because those are much easier to solve than what's going on the support side. So, yeah, that's my video. Hopefully, it helps clear things up. I will absolutely like brainstorm ways to fix Sombra or tank if that's really what people want, or Roadhog and stuff. But I hope that clears up like what I mean when I'm saying I'm looking for Overwatch 2 to sort of readjust those, giving players obvious strengths and weaknesses again. Because I think if they do that, the game will be a lot more fun again. Because right now, like, it is not as much fun as it used to be. And I'm saying this as someone who's played 8 years. I'm not burnt out. Like I could have continued playing this game, but uh, it's not that I fell out of love with Overwatch. It's just that I know and can see that once the new characters got added, that's when I stopped having as much fun. So, yeah, and post season 9 was terrible, but that's just me.